Good morning, Dan and Amy. But in for Amy this morning is Kristen McQuarrie from the Chicago Tribune editorial board. Kristen, a pleasure to have you here.
Oh, it's just such a pleasure to be here.
A severe pleasure, I'm sure.
I mean, 4 hours of staring across the table at you.
Wow. Yeah.
It's such a treat.
We're going to get to your dream later.
Oh,
so
I forgot about that.
We'll wait for that. We'll tease that. But before we do that, one of the books really making the rounds right now is this book by J.D. Vance, Hillbilly Elegy. And the question is, particularly in the context of the presidential race and the description of the Trump supporter as the white, middle-aged male, not college-educated, is it about race? Is it about power? Maybe it's not so easy as the D.C. press would have you believe. And for an answer to the question, is the death of the hillbilly greatly exaggerated, we're now pleased to be joined by the author of Hillbilly Elegy, J.D. Vance. J.D., thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So before we get to kind of the thesis of your book, a little bit on your background. It's quite something. You grew up poor, and you're not so much anymore. Give us a little bit of your story.
Yeah, so I grew up in a southern Ohio steel town. That's one of these classic places where Main Street looks more and more depressing, and the steel mill that employed a lot of people is no longer employing so many people. I grew up in a family with a lot of addiction problems and domestic chaos, but I managed to get out thanks to my grandmother and to the United States Marine Corps. Now I work in Silicon Valley as an investor. So my life has been, in some ways, it's been very representative of what folks call the American dream. But as I write about in the book, it's not, it's not that easy. It's been a lot more complicated than that. And that's one of the reasons I wrote, is to try to explain why that's happening.
You talk in your book about the loyalty and secrecy sort of the hillbilly ethic, and that there's an honor code associated with that, which means maybe you're not supposed to move up into a different wealth bracket. Explain how you kind of have balanced both worlds.
Yes, there's definitely a sort of pressure not to become too big for your britches, as folks back home say, which I think is an important impulse, right? It keeps people humble. It makes people remember where they came from, and not grow too disconnected from the place that they grew up in. But at the same time, it does create certain pressures not to leave. And when you grow up in an area where there isn't a whole lot of upward mobility, sometimes the only way to actually have a better job is to leave the place you grew up in. So you definitely have to balance, that desire for a better life with the desire to stay close to your home and family, which is, something that I try to do, and I think everybody tries to strike that balance differently.
How has the community and communities like it that you grew up in, how has it changed since you were a kid? One of the things that I saw you discuss was that, a lot of these communities and these areas of the country are considered the Bible Belt, but maybe they're not so much anymore.
Yeah, one of the big trends in this area of the world, like you said, we think of these areas as the Bible Belt. But if you look at actual church attendance rates as opposed to just religious identification rates, people aren't going to church as much. They're calling themselves Christian. They're saying that they care very much about their faith, and I believe that they do. But they're also not going to church, and as you may know, church brings a lot of social benefits. So it's in some ways a troubling trend that people are more and more disconnected from traditional religious institutions.
So you try to explain in this book what makes this population tick. So as it relates to this presidential campaign, what is this crop of voters looking for, and what makes them tick politically?
Well, I think, first of all, they're proud. So I think the past 5 or 10 years, especially the wars that haven't gone very well, the sense of dislocation and anxiety that surrounds them, I think that's really hit them hard, and they've been looking for somebody in some ways to take that fight, to take the frustration that they feel at many of the political elites to those political elites. I think that's one of the big appeals of Donald Trump. But folks, I think, fundamentally are really pessimistic about the future. And it's not just about economic prospects or job prospects. It's primarily about the fact that they see more and more people dying of heroin overdoses, that they see that it's more difficult for their children to have their share of the American dream. And so I think one of the big things going on here is that folks are very, very frustrated about the future and very cynical about the future, and that's driving a lot of their political decisions.
We're talking to J.D. Vance. He's the author of Hillbilly Elegy. In a piece this week in the Pittsburgh Gazette, Selena Zito writes about the Gallup survey that was done, these 87,000 interviews that present a sort of profile of the Trump supporter. And I want to read just one paragraph that she wrote from her piece and see if this rings true for you in terms of the populations that you're speaking of and writing about. A lot of the support for Trump has to do with a perceived loss of power. It's not so much about race. She writes, not power in the way that Washington or Wall Street boardrooms view power, but power in the sense that these people see a diminishing respect for them and their ways of life, their work ethic, their tendency not to be mobile. Many live in the same 8 square miles that their father and their father's father lived in.
Well, I think that definitely rings true, and it gets back to what I spoke about earlier, which is pride. People want respect. I think they want to feel that their way of life and their way of thinking about the world is respected, even if other people don't share it. And one of the big trends in American society right now is that the folks with financial and political power just aren't living among working-class Americans. They don't really know that many working-class Americans. Maybe the folks on the coast think of the middle of the country as flyover country, or maybe they just don't think of it at all. But regardless, I think it's very true that when people see their communities falling apart, they feel judged in some ways by people who work and live in Washington, D.C. I think it creates this mix of frustration, and it's not all that surprising that the frustration has taken the form that it has.
So you describe this as you got out of that sort of your upbringing, but what about you today still reflects the fact that you came from this, I don't want to, is it a hillbilly town? You came from this small town in Ohio. What about you today still reflects that?
Well, I like to think that I still care a lot about the values that I was brought up with. Hopefully I'm still very loyal to my friends and family. I believe I'm very patriotic, which is important to this group of people. I care a lot about the country, and I think that I owe it certain things. But fundamentally, I think that I'm humble when I try to remind myself in my life in Silicon Valley that it's not all about money and power. The values that you have, the way you treat people is a lot more important than whether you have a good job or whether you have fancy credentials next to your name. And I think that's something that frankly, the elites could learn from this area of the country. Folks really care about who you are and not so much what you do, and that's a really important lesson.
Do you think that there is a racial component to this and perhaps some resentment? It's not maybe overtly race, but it's more kind of attention paid. So we talk about disproportionately minority neighborhoods in our big cities where elites live, and we're very concerned, at least we express concern. We're not doing a whole lot about it that's effective, but there's a lot more expression of concern. There's a lot more discussion about violence on the south and west sides of Chicago, for example, that are predominantly African-American neighborhoods. And it's relatively easy to dismiss the quote-unquote white trash, and even to use that phrase, in towns like you grew up in. And I wonder if that creates any resentment that we get the back of the hand treatment. We have some of the same struggles as people living in urban centers, but we get the back of the hand.
Yeah, well, I definitely think that there is a racial component to it. I mean, so some of the folks who are supporting Donald Trump are obviously, they don't have views about race that a lot of us would be comfortable with. But I think a lot of folks probably feel just like what you're saying. They're not racist as much as they are worried that there are perceptions that folks have about them that maybe they don't share about other groups of people. That it's, as my grandma once said, that it's okay to look down on white trash, or it's okay to look down on hillbillies, but it's not okay to look down on other groups of people. Mm-hmm. I think that perception is definitely very much alive and well in this community. I think, frankly, it's definitely real, but it's also probably overblown. I don't think that elites look down on people quite as much, at least based on the color of their skin, as folks back home think. But I do think it's a very real thing, and it definitely adds to this sense, again, that folks who have political power don't really care about the towns and the people that I knew growing up.
Well, so what is it that the towns and the people that you grew up with, what is it that they want? Do they want a life preserver, or do they want to just be kind of left to their own devices and be respected for doing so?
I think what they want most of all is the politics that at least recognizes some of the serious concerns that they have. It's just a matter of fact that if you live in these communities, one of the biggest things on your mind right now is this horrible prescription opioid and heroin epidemic. That's really, if you look at the statistics, white working class youth are more likely to die of heroin overdoses than any other group in the United States. These people are really worried about what's happening. I think recognizing that problem goes a long way to making these people feel politically like they're part of the conversation. And so it's a lot of ways, I think that the solutions are going to differ based on political party or based on the issue. But I think first a recognition of what these people are going through, what my people are going through, goes a long way to diffusing some of these political tensions that we see today.
How are you viewed by the people that you grew up with?
Well, it's funny. I've heard from a lot of people in the past 6 to 12 weeks since this book came out that I had that I knew really had much of an opinion of me. But it's been very positive. People feel in some ways that someone needed to tell the story. They needed to talk about the problems in our community honestly, but also compassionately. And I hope that I've done that. I'm sure that some people think that I've kind of abandoned things, but I haven't heard a whole lot about that. And it's something that I try to be very mindful of, that I am fundamentally a part of this community. I will always be part of this community, and it's got to be a place and a group of people that I care about forever.
He's a former Marine, Yale Law School graduate, now the author of the book Hillbilly Elegy. J.D. Vance, thanks so much for joining us. Good luck with the book.
Great, thank you. Thank you for having me.
And he joined us on the Turnkey.Pro answer line.
This is